In the Wikipedia article entitled Rape During the Occupation of Germany, it is asserted that when the Yugoslav partisan politician Milovan Djilas complained about rapes in Yugoslavia, Joseph Stalin reportedly stated that he should understand it if a soldier who had crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire and death has fun with a woman or takes some trifle. On another occasion, when told that Red Army soldiers sexually maltreated German refugees, he reportedly said, "We lecture our soldiers too much. Let them have their initiative." Nevertheless, there are no surviving records to prove that rape was legally sanctioned. Starting with the initiative quote, the Wikipedia article cites Beyond Duty by Walter S. Zapatochny Jr., which in turn cites a Daily Mail article entitled Stalin's Army of Rapists by Andrew Roberts, erroneously referred to as J.M. Roberts by Zapatochny, which in turn cites World War II Behind Closed Doors by Lawrence Rees, which in turn cites Russia's War by Richard Overy. And so this is where the quote in question supposedly originates. Stalin was not ignorant of the behavior of Red Army soldiers, but it worried him little. When he was told of the treatment meted out to German refugees, he was reported to have replied, "We lecture our soldiers too much. Let them have some initiative." However, not only is there no citation provided, but Overy doesn't even attribute the initiative quote to whoever reported it. This is especially perplexing, given that he goes on to quote Milovan Djilas in the very next sentence. When the Yugoslav communist Milovan Djilas complained to Stalin's face that the Red Army was raping Yugoslav women, he received a lecture on the Russian attitude to war. Thankfully, the initiative quote also appears in The Russians in Germany by Norman Naimark, who cites conversations with Stalin as his source. Stalin's lack of sensitivity to this issue, Djilas adds, was also apparent in his attitude toward complaints during the East Prussian campaign. "We lecture our soldiers too much," Djilas reports Stalin as saying. "Let them have some initiative." It is therefore unclear why the authors of the Wikipedia article chose to cite Zapatochny rather than the actual source, Conversations with Stalin by Milovan Djilas. Likewise, the citation Zapatochny provides immediately prior to the Daily Mail article is the same source that the Daily Mail article itself cites, World War II Behind Closed Doors by Lawrence Rees. Why Zapatochny felt the need to include the Daily Mail as a source at all is therefore confusing. In any case, proper attribution of authorship isn't the only issue here. On another occasion, when Stalin was told that Red Army soldiers were sexually mistreating German refugees, he is reported to have said, "We lecture our soldiers too much. Let them have some initiative." On another occasion, when told that Red Army soldiers sexually maltreated German refugees, he said, "We lecture our soldiers too much. Let them have their initiative." Like a game of telephone, the treatment meted out to German refugees in Overy becomes sexually mistreating German refugees in Rees and sexually maltreated German refugees in Roberts and Zapatochny respectively. This is despite the fact that there is no indication that Overy was specifically referring to sexual violence in the aforementioned passage. In the interest of charitability, one could argue that it is implied by the sentence that follows, but as we will see, this explanation does not hold water. Rees, Roberts, and Zapatochny should have done their due diligence. This is especially true with respect to Rees, considering he actually cites Conversations with Stalin in the very same paragraph as the initiative quote. So what does the actual source of the quote say? "Soon afterwards, when I returned from Moscow, I heard, to my horror, of a far more significant example of Stalin's understanding attitude toward the sins of Red Army personnel. While crossing East Prussia, Soviet soldiers, especially the tank units, had regularly shelled and killed all the German civilian refugees, women and children. Stalin was informed of this and asked what should be done. He replied, 'We lecture our soldiers too much. Let them have some initiative.' As we can see, Stalin was allegedly responding to concerns about the shelling of German civilian refugees, not the sexual mistreatment of them. Ironically, Overy actually downplays the shelling of German civilian refugees by referring to it as treatment meted out. With respect to Rees, either he didn't actually read Conversations with Stalin and simply chose to reproduce a misreading of Overy's ambiguous presentation of the initiative quote, or he intentionally lied about its contents. Admittedly, Naimark's juxtaposition of this issue with complaints is also ambiguous, and could therefore be read as referring to complaints about rape. As we've already seen, however, these complaints were actually about the shelling of German civilian refugees, not rape. In any case, it's important to note that Gillis did not hear this directly from Stalin. He also doesn't mention who told him this, nor to whom Stalin was replying when he allegedly said this. So while it's entirely possible, plausible even, that Stalin might have said it, there's no way to verify it. It is hearsay. Turning now to the fun with a woman quote, Wikipedia cites Iron Curtain by Anne Applebaum. Unfortunately, I was unable to access a copy of said text. Thankfully, Zapatochny refers to the same quote, and cites Rees as his source, who in turn cites conversations with Stalin by Milovan Gillis. Once again, a circuitous route is taken to the primary source. Once again, this is an example of poor scholarship. He wept, crying out, and such an army was insulted by no one else but Gillis. Gillis, of whom I could least have expected such a thing, a man whom I received so well, and an army which did not spare its blood for you. Does Gillis, who is himself a writer, not know what human suffering and the human heart are? Can't he understand it if a soldier who has crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire and death has fun with a woman or takes some trifle? First published 17 years after the events described therein, the potential influence of personal biases and lapses in memory should be borne in mind. Gillis even concedes as much in the preface. I have endeavored to present the facts as exactly as possible. If this book is still not free from my views of today, this should be attributed neither to malice nor to the bias of one who took part in those events, but rather to the nature of memory itself, and to my effort to elucidate past encounters and events in the light of what I know now. Indeed, by his own admission, Gillis takes some degree of creative liberty with the material, so as to make the subject as interesting as he can. I hold that humans and human relationships are more important than dry facts, and so I have paid greater attention to them. And if the book contains anything that might be called literary, this too should be ascribed less to my style of expression than to my desire to make the subject as interesting, clear, and true as I can. While it may not have been possible due to extenuating circumstances, there is no indication that any attempt was made, by any of the authors discussed in this essay, to corroborate Gillis's account by interviewing the other Yugoslav communist ministers that attended the intimate dinner in Stalin's villa. At the very least, such limitations should have been discussed. Still, I was pleasantly surprised when I, too, was taken to an intimate dinner in Stalin's villa. Dr. Shubashich naturally knew nothing about it. Only we Yugoslav communist ministers were there, and on the Soviet side, Stalin's closest associates, Malenkov, Bulganin, General Antonov, Beria, and of course, Molotov. Nevertheless, if we are to give Gillis the benefit of the doubt and assume that both the initiative quote and the fun with a woman quote aren't the product of misremembrance, miscommunication, or invention, it would appear that Stalin was indeed a rape apologist, at least within the context of his conversations with Gillis. Stalin's public pronouncements, however, tell an entirely different story, but more on that later. Ultimately, what one chooses to believe depends entirely on how much stock one is willing to put in Gillis's long-term memory and/or integrity. Given that Gillis himself refers to Stalin as one of the cruelest, most despotic figures in human history, it may be prudent to take both quotes with a grain of salt. Returning to Beyond Duty, Zapatochny writes, in World War II, Behind Closed Doors, the historian Lawrence Rees points out that although rape was officially a crime in the Red Army, Stalin had in fact explicitly condoned it as a method of rewarding the soldiers and terrorizing German civilians. In yet another example of poor scholarship, Zapatochny neglects to provide a page number for the Rees citation. This is most likely because this passage is an actual fact lifted from the aforementioned Daily Mail article written by Andrew Roberts. In his fine new book, World War II Behind Closed Doors, the historian Lawrence Rees points out that although rape was officially a crime in the Red Army, in fact, Stalin explicitly condoned it as a method of rewarding the soldiers and terrorizing German civilians. Incidentally, it would seem that Zapatochny has a habit of quoting when he should be paraphrasing, and paraphrasing when he should be quoting. In The Russians in Germany, A History of the Soviet Zone of Occupation, 1945 to 1949, Norman Naimark commented, Although the exact number of women and girls who were raped by members of the Red Army in the months preceding and the years following the capitulation will never be known, their numbers are likely in the hundreds of thousands, quite possibly as high as the 2 million victims estimate made by Barbara Jor in Befreier und Befreite. The actual quote, however, is as follows. It is highly unlikely that historians will ever know how many German women were raped by Soviet soldiers in the months before and years after the capitulation. It may have been tens of thousands, or more likely in the hundreds of thousands. It is even possible that up to 2 million women and girls suffered this crime of violence, most while being uprooted from their homes in East Prussia, Silesia, or the Sudetenland, others while living in the Soviet zone of occupation. Worse still, not only does Zapatochny fail to accurately reproduce the text he's quoting, but he also fails to cite it properly. Citations 8 and 9 are missing in both the hardcover and ebook editions of Beyond Duty. With respect to the Daily Mail quote Zapatochny plagiarized, it appears to have been Frankensteined by Roberts from the following passages in Rees. And though theft and rape were officially crimes in the Red Army, there was a sense from the very beginning of the occupation that the Soviets were intent on despoiling Eastern Poland, despoiling property, despoiling people, despoiling ideas. In pursuit of the Marxist ideal of equality, the Soviet authorities turned conventional values upside down. For the most part, nothing was officially said about the crimes. Significantly, Pravda, the Soviet newspaper, never referred to them. And although there were, on occasion, attempts to enforce the official line that rape committed by Soviet soldiers was a crime, so few cases were prosecuted that it is impossible not to conclude that the offense was often tolerated by the Soviet authorities. Stalin, at least, only condoned rape, but Beria, the head of the NKVD, was a rapist himself. It should go without saying that this kind of editorializing has no place in historical scholarship. Nevertheless, according to Naimark, as one Soviet eyewitness stated, the responsible organs, meaning the NKVD, Glavperka, and military police, did very little to control the activities of these Soviet marauders. The NKVD personnel were also known to brutalize the population and even engage in rape themselves, which made the problem of controlling Soviet troops all the more complicated. Evidently, there is at least some truth to Rees's claim that rape was often tolerated by the Soviet authorities. However, as we've already seen, both of the quotes attributed to Stalin are taken from conversations with Stalin by Milovan-Djilas. Objectively speaking, however, there is no evidence that Stalin condoned rape, much less that he condoned rape as a method of rewarding the soldiers and terrorizing German civilians. In the April 14, 1945 Pravda article by G.F. Alexandrov, head of the propaganda department of the Central Committee, apparently speaking for the Communist Party and for Stalin, Alexandrov attacked Ilya Ehrenberg's well-known view that the war was a struggle of extermination against the Germans. If one would agree with Ehrenberg's views, Alexandrov wrote, then one would have to conclude that the entire population of Germany must share the fate of the Hitlerite clique. Alexandrov concluded by restating Stalin's order of February 23, 1942, which became the slogan of slogans in Soviet-occupied Germany. It would be laughable to identify Hitler's cliques with the German people, with the German state. Historical experience shows that Hitlers come and go. The German people, the German state remain. Alexandrov's article was published and broadcast to the front 2 days before the last great Soviet offensive that would carry the Soviet army from the Oder to Berlin. Stalin's command to his troops reinforced the Soviet desire to find supporters among the German population. In conquering the capital of Germany, Stalin ordered, Soviet soldiers should demonstrate the highest discipline, proving the high level of Soviet morale to the world as a whole. According to Stalin's order, the soldiers were to carry with them the great idea of communism, which was not to be compromised by the least indiscipline. Passing over his own role in encouraging the earlier depredations, Stalin then stated that the cruel treatment of the German population is not useful for us, because it increases the resistance of the German army. Curiously, in this last passage, Naimark accuses Stalin of passing over his own role in encouraging the earlier depredations. However, Naimark doesn't elaborate on this claim, nor does he provide any evidence to substantiate it. Nevertheless, from the excerpts above, we can conclude that Stalin was indeed aware of the atrocities perpetrated by the Red Army. However, it appears he was much more concerned with the reputation of the Red Army than with its actual behavior. Stalin's priorities were therefore political rather than ethical. Nevertheless, the fact remains, contrary to Zapatochny's claims, that Stalin saw no benefit in terrorizing German civilians. There are no surviving records to prove it, but it was apparent to survivors that rape was not only condoned, but legally sanctioned by representatives of the Soviet government. Here, Zapatochny cites The Russians in Germany by Norman Naimark. The page in question opens with the second half of You Mothers, a poem by Werner Stern. Yourselves of the guilt that burns in your hearts, don't stand there whimpering, complaining, whining. We are not interested in your feelings of blame. We don't need your tears of atonement, nor your damp eyes full of guilt. We need deeds. They alone can touch us. A firm grip of the hand carries more weight than any tears that cool the cheeks. And everything you give brings us closer. You women who love your children, understand also the misery of other children. Give. And concludes with the opening paragraphs of the subchapter, Women's Politics. The threat and reality of rape made many German women fiercely resistant to the appeals of communists on behalf of friendship with the Russians. In an August 3, 1945 meeting of some 600 German women in Berlin-Hermsdorf, the first open women's meeting of its kind after the war, the local KPD chief opened the discussion by citing all the material help the Soviets had provided the Germans in the first weeks after the liberation. At this point, a KPD report noted, a roar went up in the hall, with loud interruptions, insults to the Red Army, for example. And then they stole everything from us. Just stop with your talk about Russians, etc. With further weak attempts to point to the merits of the Red Army, or to justify its behavior as victors, an uproarious, biting laughter arose in the hall. The KPD reporter ruefully noted that the women's meeting quickly turned into an anti-communist and anti-Soviet demonstration. In the concluding open discussion, the almost fascist mood reached its highest point. The statements of the individual speakers were accusatory and provocational, without any understanding for the actual situation and the limiting difficulties. It was true, he added, that there was little to eat in Hermsdorf, and that the women had to stand in endless lines. But their behavior demonstrated that they were unwilling to accept responsibility for their own situation. In any case, gatherings of this sort were hopeless, he concluded. We won nothing at this meeting, and lost a great deal. Rape itself never became an issue of open contention between German women and the party, or within the party itself. It was not something people talked about or wanted to admit. Zapatochny's weasel words of apparent to survivors aside, there is no evidence to support the claim that rape was legally sanctioned by representatives of the Soviet government on the page indicated, nor anywhere else for that matter. The closest Naimark comes to making such a claim is when he quotes Hermann Matzkowski, a veteran German communist and a newly appointed local mayor of a district of Königsberg. On November 6 and 7, 1945, Red Army Day, the mayor wrote, Russian soldiers actually seemed to have permission for every kind of transgression against the Germans. Men were beaten, most women were raped, including my 71-year-old mother who died by Christmas. Note, however, the use of the word seemed. It should go without saying that an impression isn't evidence of legality. In fact, contrary to Zapatochny's assertion, Naimark writes, there is little evidence that Soviet commanders purposely used violence in East Prussia as an example for the rest of Germany in the hope of inducing an early German surrender. They surely would have been aware that the Wehrmacht could use the East Prussian case to bolster the determination of its own troops. In fact, there seems to be good reason to believe that Soviet officers were surprised by the intensity of the terror that followed the invasion. Although the Soviets did the best they could to bring their troops under control, it is important to understand that incidents of rape continued up to, and no doubt after, the founding of the German Democratic Republic. After the summer of 1945, Soviet soldiers caught in the act of rape were generally punished, though the harshness of the punishment varied. In some cases, the offender was severely punished, even executed in the case of rape and murder, in front of his entire battalion to get the point across to other soldiers. After a period of great laxness about relations between Russians and Germans that lasted until the spring and summer of 1947, the Soviet authorities tried to deal with a variety of problems, rape included, that had strained Soviet-German relations by increasingly isolating their troops from the German population. The clearest message to the troops about the unacceptability of rape did not come until March 1949, when the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet issued a directive increasing the punishment for the crime. The directive was sent by SVAG to every commandatura in the zone, for distribution to all soldiers, sergeants, and officers. The communication pointedly stated that the new directive would be applied to all Soviet citizens in Germany. The new punishment for rape, according to the law of January 4, 1949, was considered draconian in comparison to early Soviet laws. Now, conviction for rape carried a mandatory sentence of 10 to 15 years in a labor camp. Rape of minors, group rape, and rape resulting in severe injury carried sentences of 10 to 20 years. These quotes also contradict Overy's claim that Stalin did nothing to prevent the Red Army from committing atrocities against the German population. Certainly, one could contend, as Neumark does, that Stalin and the Soviet authorities did not do nearly enough to prevent or punish the rapes. However, by no means can one reasonably argue that they did nothing. The dreadful disorder resulting from the East Prussian campaign did not make enough of an impact on the Red Army hierarchy to institute the kinds of punishment that might have prevented further rape, as Soviet armies pushed beyond the Vistula into Silesia and Pomerania, what was to become Western Poland. In Child of the Revolution, Wolfgang Leonhard recounts the following exchange. On the Sunday after the party congress, I was driving with a leading member of the SED in the Soviet zone, and we had an opportunity to talk without interruption. I decided not to let the opportunity pass. A quarter of an hour later, however, we had touched on another delicate matter. This was the conduct of the Soviet troops, and the veto on the SED taking any attitude towards it on their own initiative. I tried again. Stalin replied with an old Russian proverb, "In every family there is a black sheep." He said nothing more. When one of us tried to put the matter more seriously and to hint at the consequences, he was interrupted by Stalin. "I will not allow anyone to drag the reputation of the Red Army in the mud." That was the end of the conversation. Again, like the initiative quote, this is hearsay. Nevertheless, assuming this exchange occurred exactly as described, the tone of Stalin's reply stands in stark contrast to that of the Fun with a Woman quote. By allegedly describing the criminal elements within the Red Army as black sheep, Stalin simultaneously expresses explicit disapproval of the crimes while downplaying their prevalence, as though only a handful of bad apples were responsible for the atrocities. Obviously, this attitude is problematic to say the least. However, it is hardly the same as explicitly condoning rape, as Zapatochnik claims. It could, however, be argued that Stalin's unwillingness to openly address the Red Army's crimes created a culture of silence that enabled the rapists, and that Stalin therefore bears a certain amount of responsibility for the atrocities. As Neumark writes, in fact, the lack of open recognition by Soviet authorities of the problem of rape unquestionably contributed to its persistence. In contrast, Professor Olev Zhezhevsky, head of war history at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, told BBC News Online, 4,148 Red Army officers and many privates were punished for committing atrocities. Assuming for the sake of argument that this number is an accurate reflection of reality, that's still 4,148 more cases than the acceptable amount. It is clear, however, given that the lowest estimate of the number of women and girls raped by the Red Army is in the tens of thousands, that many guilty officers and soldiers went unpunished for their crimes. Rees is therefore right to emphasize the enormity of the Red Army's crimes, but to say that comparable crimes weren't committed, or that mass rape was not tolerated by the Western Allies, is patently absurd. But in the context of the Second World War in Europe, this excuse, that rape during wartime is a common, if regrettable historical occurrence, is not sustainable. Because as far as the crime of rape was concerned, the Soviets were in a league of their own. The Western Allies committed no comparable crimes of this enormity. Mass rape was not tolerated. While Neumark suggests that the crimes perpetrated by Soviet and American soldiers can be compared only superficially, comparable crimes were indeed committed by the Western Allies. Similarly, even the surprisingly high incidence of rape and violent crime committed by American soldiers can be compared only superficially with the Soviet case. The poor discipline and rapacity of Soviet soldiers was matched in the Western zones only by French and Moroccan troops. Especially during the initial occupation of Baden and Württemberg, German women were subject to the same indiscriminate rampaging that they faced in the Eastern Zone. On the superficiality of the comparison between American and Soviet soldiers, Naimark elaborates in the footnotes. Martin Van Creveld writes that during the war, more US servicemen were executed for rape than for any other crime, particularly if they were black, and particularly if the victim ended up dead as well as violated. But the number of cases was not large. Although it's beyond the scope of this essay, and arguably beyond the scope of Naimark's book, given the historical context, the disproportionate punishment of black people for the crime of rape was no doubt racially motivated. This quote should therefore not be taken at face value. Ironically, despite, or arguably because of, their unwillingness to allow open discussion of the atrocities committed by the Red Army, the Soviet leadership's political ambitions vis-à-vis Germany were almost certainly doomed to fail. The German women's fear of Russians and the association of Soviet troops with rape and looting became the central German argument against closer ties with the Soviet Union. In the West, it became a topos for propaganda against making concessions to the Russians. In the Soviet zone itself, it became a severe handicap for the KPD and SED leadership's efforts to build support for a communist future. The handicap was all the more severe because the issue of rape could not be discussed in public without offending the sensibilities of the Soviet authorities, and therefore of their closest German communist friends. Equally important were the social taboos on the subject of rape. The defensiveness of German men on the one hand, and the sometimes repressed, though unjustifiable sense of guilt among German women on the other, magnified the social psychological dimensions of rape, that is, the ways it affected the masses of people in their dealings with the Soviets and with each other. Plagiarism, misquotation, misattribution, missing citations. These are the kinds of errors one would expect to find in an essay written by an undergrad, not the published works of professional historians. And yet all of the authors discussed in this essay, with the exception of Naimark, are guilty of one or more of these errors. If there is a silver lining here, however, it's that the poor scholarship discussed in this essay provides a useful case study of how hearsay misreadings, intentional or otherwise, can become facts. It also highlights the need for the critical reading of sources, especially when using Wikipedia.